Okay, Chapter 2 we're going to talk about island environments, and this title's a bit misleading for this chapter because what we're really talking about are what are islands and how are they formed and how do they differ from one another. Not all islands are created equal. Here in this illustration we're going to revisit this in a bit, but you can see here the ground, the surface of the earth is indicated in brown, and then of course there's water in blue. And you can see to the far left is emergent land. That would be, for example, the continent itself. A little bit further out there's a little bump that sticks up out of the water on the continental shelf, representing a continental island. And then way out to sea, poking out of the oceanic crust, is an oceanic island. So this is just the first example that you'll see of how we classify different islands, and this is based entirely on how they're formed and where they sit today. So let's begin to think about exactly what an island is. And the quote at the beginning of chapter 2 is really illustrative of the breadth of things that can be classified as islands. And the picture beneath this quote does the same. So I want you to think about the quote first. So from cow pats, so piles of cow poop, to South America. It's difficult to see what is not, or at some time has not been, an island. So how could a pile of cow poop be an island? How could South America be an island when it's as big as it is? Look beneath. This is a picture of the digestive system of a human being, from the stomach to the rectum. And with a magnifying glass, they're illustrating some of the microbial organisms that are living within the gut of this individual or of a human. So think about your gut as an island, right? There are lots of organisms that live within your gut that cannot live outside of your gut. They are isolated from similar species in the individual sitting next to you, your roommate, the other members of this class. Your E. coli live on a different island than my E. coli, okay? The same principles, the biological principles that we will apply to islands, apply to islands in the ocean, apply to your stomach, the organisms that live within your stomach. They apply to the organisms that live within piles of cow crap in a field. Okay? Because they live only in the feces of cows. They don't live in the grass around it or in the trees over top of it. Okay? So there are lots of different ways that we can think about islands. Another island is illustrated here at the bottom of this slide. And if you look closely, it'll become clear to you that this is a really interesting aerial shot of Central Park in Manhattan. Okay? So I want you to think about this wooded, grassy, forested patch right in the middle of one of the largest, most dense and congested cities in the world. Okay, it's full of trees and grass, and there are many organisms that live within Central Park that you will not find even 1 block away. Okay, if you walk a block or two away, you're not going to find raccoons or certain species of bird, because they simply don't live in the alleys and on the rooftops of these sky rises, okay? So you can think of Central Park as an island. So above, I want you to first think of a type of category for islands. We can classify islands as being either true islands, so land surrounded by water. That's what we generally think of when we think of islands. When I told you we were visiting 6 islands on our trip, you were thinking about visiting, and rightfully so, true islands. Now, habitat islands are also islands, and these are patches that are surrounded by contrasting and usually inhospitable habitat. So think about the microbes in your gut, okay? They live in a habitat island. It's a patch of habitat that they can inhabit that is surrounded by inhospitable habitat, the outside of your body, okay? Simply not going to work for them. Even the non-digestive system portions of your body, they can't live in your veins and arteries. They cannot live in your liver. They are in the gut and in the gut alone. So that is a habitat island. Okay? So, let's first start thinking about true islands. What are the different forms of true islands? So, of true islands, so islands surrounded by water, we can break those down into those that are classified as oceanic islands. So oceanic islands are ones that have formed in the ocean. They've never been connected to a continent. And Hawaii is a great example of this. The islands of the Galapagos are also a great example of this. We're going to talk quite a bit about both of those island chains. So oceanic islands is the first category. Second category would be continental fragments. So these are basically pieces of continents that have broken off and moved away. Okay? So Madagascar is an excellent example of a chunk of a continent, that being Africa, that broke off and moved away. And if you look on page 17 of your text, I encourage you to read box 2. You'll have a bit more context for understanding how Madagascar separated from Africa and moved away. Okay? There are also continental shelf islands. So these are islands that, I'm going to show you that first slide image again that showed continental shelf and oceanic islands. But continental shelf islands are islands that are in the ocean, but they are on the continental shelf, which is not that much lower than the exposed land of the continent itself, and they can be repeatedly connected to the continent. Okay, so I'll make this a bit more clear in a subsequent slide. Okay, and then islands in freshwater bodies. This is one you don't often think about, but if you drive across the Mississippi, if you drive anywhere around the Delta, you'll see bodies of water, and this could be a large pond. It could be the Mississippi River. It could be one of the Great Lakes in the northern U.S. Islands can exist within freshwater bodies as well. Okay. All right. So here's an example of a continental island, and here I've got a screenshot of from Google Earth showing the western coast of South America. You can see here Ecuador, and far off the coast of Ecuador are the Galapagos Islands. These islands are formed through volcanic activity. So basically volcanoes have popped up under the ocean and grown through eruption and emergence of molten rock until they pop up out of the ocean. So look at the schematic above and to the right, you'll see an oceanic island. It looks like a large pointy cone sticking up out of the ocean, and that's exactly what these are. Sometimes these emergent islands are quite high, right? They have significant elevation. The big island in Hawaii has snow at the top of its mountain. It's so high, okay? But that height is dwarfed in comparison to the enormous size of the mountain that lies beneath the ocean, okay? So these are really, really, really large mountains that have finally reached a height significant enough to emerge from the water, okay? Now look at the top illustration again here, and you can see I've touched on these continental islands or these continental shelf islands, and you can see the difference between these continental shelf islands and the oceanic islands. So the continental shelf island lies on the shelf. It is a bit higher than the rest of the shelf around it, and it is sticking up out of the water, okay? A great example of that would be the Florida Keys. Here you can see a Google Earth screenshot of Florida and the surrounding ocean. You can see the continental shelf extends pretty far out from Florida on the west coast. It goes way out into the middle of the Gulf. On the east coast, it does not go that far, okay? Right off of Miami, that water gets very, very, very deep, okay? But the Keys themselves, these islands lie on the continental shelf. They're slightly higher than the shelf around them. They're high enough to be up out of the water, but not by much. Very few areas in the Keys are above 10 feet in elevation. Okay? So think about what happens as global sea level changes. You might not have thought about this before, but sea level is not the same today as it has always been. Okay, there are many times in the past where sea level has been much, much higher than it is today. So what would that mean for the Keys? Well, they would be completely underwater, as would much of South Florida. Actually, if you look at the yellow dot on the left side, or the west coast of Florida there, that's actually right near my hometown where I grew up, and my house was about 10 miles inland from the beach and was at about 4 feet elevation. Okay, so if sea level goes up even 10 feet, you lose a lot of that peninsula of Florida, including all of the Florida Keys. Now think about the other direction. Sea level has been lower than it currently is in the past. And if sea level were to be lower, would those Florida Keys be lots of different islands separated from one another, necessitating a long series of bridges that connects them all? They would not. If sea level is lowered, more of the continental shelf would be exposed and the islands would be connected. These types of sea level fluctuations have really important implications for biodiversity patterns. They affect the ability of organisms to move freely from one area to the next, and we're going to talk quite a bit about that in later lectures. Okay, here I want to show you another continental shelf island because this is one we're actually going to be visiting. So if you look at the red dot, that is actually the island of Roatan, just off the northern coast of Honduras. So we'll be visiting this island, and this is where we're going snorkeling and diving. And what's really interesting about Roatan is made clear by the bathymetry, the imagery of the shape and structure of the continental shelf that it is part of. And what it makes clear is that Roatan is actually just a mountain chain. It's a mountain ridge that it's the only part of the ridge that is sticking up out of the ocean. And just to the left of it, you can see that there's another darker blue bit. That's actually another island, Utila, that is also part of the same mountain ridge and sticking up out of the water, though it's a separate island. Though would they have been separate if sea level were lower, say 100 feet? Probably not. Okay, so this is a really interesting aspect of this island that we are going to talk about, and it makes a really important impact on what organisms you find on Roatan versus other islands like Grand Cayman that are just a bit to the northwest of what we can see in this image. Okay, habitat islands. This is a very stark image of a habitat island. So this is a patch of the Amazon rainforest that has been cut down, and a bit of the forest has been left intact in the middle of this area that's been cut. This is kind of the exact same thing that I showed you with the image of Central Park, that isolated patch of habitat, isolated and surrounded by the cityscape. Okay, here we've got forest surrounded by a logged area. We see this a lot here in Mississippi. When you drive by cotton fields or soybean fields or corn fields, you'll see loads and loads, acres, hundreds of acres of field, planted field, and there will be patches of forest in between it or right in the middle of it sometimes, perhaps where the farmer's house used to be, you'll see a patch of woods. And I want you to think about what that means for the organisms that live around there. Is it going to affect, if you look at this, these two patches here in the Amazonian rainforest, how is that going to affect what species live in those two little patches of forest? Is that habitat, that small one, let's say, that's 100 meters on a side, is that patch big enough to support a jaguar? Probably not. It's not going to find enough food in there. Is it a big enough patch to support a cricket? A turtle? Okay. It probably is large enough to support some of those things. Okay. But are they going to be able to find mates in that small patch? That depends. A cricket probably will. A turtle probably can't. Okay. So the size of the habitat patch is really important, just like the size of islands is important. So all of these things are things that we're going to be talking about repeatedly, but as we discuss them, I want you always to be thinking about, how big is this island? Is it able to support a full population, a breeding population of species X, Y, or Z? So can either of these habitat islands here support a breeding population of crickets? I'd say both probably can. Can either support a breeding population of turtles? I'd question that. Jaguars? Definitely not. Okay? Large birds of prey? Probably not. Very small songbirds? Maybe the large one. Okay? So the things that we think about when we think about islands depend a great deal on the characteristics of the island itself, but then you also have to consider the biology of the species that we're talking about. So this starts to bring into question and into your mind, hopefully your train of thought, how do islands become populated by organisms? And this figure comes from box 2.2. This is the second time I've referred to this separate box within the chapter, starting on page 17. I'd like you to read that box. It talks a good bit about the separation of the supercontinent of Gondwana, which is the southern half of Pangaea, if you've learned about Pangaea in the past. But when we think about islands and their isolation, there are different ways that organisms can get to islands. And here on the top left, the first mechanism for organisms to get to islands is rafting. So if you can't tell what that is, it's a cartoon of a tree with a possum hanging off the tree, and he's just floating out to sea. Okay? So if you think about what kinds of islands have to be colonized by rafting, that would be things like the Galapagos, oceanic islands that have never touched the mainland. There's never been a way for terrestrial animals, those ground-dwelling animals that have to walk on land and don't swim well, for them to get to these oceanic islands like Hawaii, like the Galapagos, unless they float out there. Okay? Now, land bridges. Land bridges is another mechanism that would allow organisms to move from some source, usually the mainland, and get to the island. Here we've got an elephant or a mammoth walking across a land bridge, getting from one giant landmass to another. If you think back to the illustration I showed you of the Florida Keys and the low or the shallow water separating those islands on the continental shelf just off the coast of Florida, think about the sea level dropping and all of those islands becoming connected to one another. If that were to happen, then organisms like deer could walk from Miami all the way out to Key West. Okay? It's one continuous linear stretch of land. But if sea level comes back up a couple thousand years later, then what will happen? That linear stretch of land will again become a series of islands in sequence, and they will be isolated from the mainland, from the source. Okay, so this is a land bridge colonization. This allows terrestrial organisms to colonize islands when they're not able to raft or when they don't raft. Okay. The third example here is jump dispersal. So I want you to think about Key West again. So Key West, if you were to drive it, is about 160 miles from Miami. Okay, that's a long way. Now I've just discussed with you how land bridges work. So if sea level drops significantly and it's a linear stretch of land, it would be very easy for deer, or in this case, in this illustration, a mammoth or horses, to walk that 165 miles. It's probably not going to be one individual doing that in their lifetime. They could, but it's unlikely. But what if sea level doesn't drop? What if these islands are separated by deep enough water that they are not going to be connected when sea level goes down? Well, here we can have something like jump dispersal. So And what happens in jump dispersal is, I want you to think about deer, because there are deer way down into the Keys. And deer are they're not likely to raft. So unlike the possum above, they are not going to float on a log from Miami to Key West. Okay? And let's just, for the sake of argument, say that Key West has not been connected to Miami by land bridges. But because deer are not going to swim 165 miles out into the ocean to get to Key West, if there is a linear chain of islands that are much closer than 165 miles, let's say they're each only a mile apart, okay? And there are 164 islands, okay? Each of them a mile apart. Deer might, over a couple millennia, swim from one island to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, right? As the island populations grow, they become crowded, and young individuals take off for nearby islands that they can see or smell good food on, and they head out and swim a mile, which they are capable of. So while deer can't swim 165 miles to Key West, they might be able to swim the short distances between the islands that comprise the Florida Keys chain to reach the same destination. Okay? And then the bottom right example illustrates the final mechanism for the origin of organisms on islands, and that is separation by plate tectonic processes. And so that would be something that happens on continental fragment islands. Like I told you about Madagascar, okay? There are a number of fossils on Madagascar that are very similar to fossils that are found on mainland Africa. So these species probably existed on both Africa and Madagascar together. And once those two fragments, Africa and Madagascar, broke apart, started drifting apart, what used to be one species slowly evolved independently on each landmass and became two. So, as an example, if you think about giant birds, the biggest bird in the world, the ostrich, that is found in Africa, okay? We know that they can't fly. It might not surprise you to learn that on the island of Madagascar, there's also a record of an enormously large bird. Here's an illustration of an elephant bird on the left with a human, Stone Age human, primitive human, in the middle, and then an ostrich on the right, a full-grown adult ostrich. Again, the largest bird in the world, okay? So if you think about this, do you think that birds, these large flightless birds, which are closely related to one another, they're called ratites, do you think they flew to Madagascar? Probably not. The way that we believe these two large flightless birds exist on very close land masses that were separated geologically about 65 million years ago is that there used to be one population of large winged flightless birds on Africa. And when Madagascar broke off, their population was separated from the African population. And what happened over millions of years is that they became larger and larger, slightly larger, well, significantly larger actually, than the ostriches of mainland Africa. This is an example of an organism that has resulted from evolutionary change over time due to continental drift and fragmentation of land masses. Okay, so the reason I ask you to read the text before you listen to this is because the order in which I present this is slightly different from the order that's presented in the text. So this section on the formation of islands is largely covered in section 2.2 starting on page 12. Okay, so here I'm illustrating to you and showing you a figure from the text, it's on page 13, how islands can form. And there's a lot going on here, but what I want you to realize is that below the asthenosphere is what you can think of as all the hot magma, the liquid on which all of our land masses are floating around. So if you've ever seen a lake or a river with big chunks of ice floating around, floating down river perhaps, and they're banging into one another, that's exactly what's happening with all the land masses on our planet, okay? And it happens very slowly, they move very slowly, but they are crashing into one another, and that's how we get these islands. That's how we get things like earthquakes, mountain chains on the continents. That's how we get a lot of the things like volcanoes that you'll see, okay? And we'll be talking about quite a bit. So here you can see the upper mantle and the oceanic crust and the continental crust on the far right, okay? So there's a mantle beneath the crust. That's kind of the layer between the hard rock and the lava in the asthenosphere, okay? If you look at what's happening here, there are areas where the asthenosphere, the molten rock, lava, is punching up through. So you can see this divergent plate boundary, a mid-oceanic ridge, okay? What's happening is you have molten rock coming up into this area. It keeps pushing up, and as it comes up, it creates basically a mountain chain in the ocean. Sometimes it breaches the surface, most times it does not, okay? It's going to come up, and it usually basically collapses under the weight of the ocean above it and moves to the right as new stuff comes up underneath it. That's why you have these black arrows going both to the right and the left at this divergent plate boundary, okay? What that means is you have oceanic crust that's growing, okay? It's growing from this divergent boundary to the right and to the left. So we're pushing cooled, solid rock to the right and to the left as new molten stuff comes up, okay? And because there are many of these continental plates on the Earth, look at the second part of figure 2.1, you can see the large plates that exist. Because there are multiple plates and they're not all moving in the same direction, they can't be, they begin to crash into one another. And if you push two things into one another, something has to give, okay? And on the right side, we can see that this oceanic crust is ending up pushing under the continental crust. So the continental crust is going to actually frequently buckle there, okay? So that's what you have happening in areas like the California coast, okay? That's why you have mountains in California. That's why you have earthquakes in California, because part of the Pacific plate is pushing under California, okay? To the left, we see oceanic crust growing as well, and it's interacting with another plate of oceanic crust that has a volcanic arc in it. So volcanoes punching out through the ocean, okay? So we have, where these two trenches are, we have two plate boundaries interacting. So each trench represents a point of interaction of two different plates, continental plates. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the types of islands that form out in the ocean, oceanic islands. And they can form either out in the middle of a plate, like the islands of Hawaii. So these are generally the result of volcanic eruptions out in the middle of a plate due to what we call a hot spot, and we'll dig into that a bit more here in a moment. The other are the ones that I've just talked about in the previous slide, where we have two different plates interacting. And in that instance, we have plates rubbing against each other, one going under the other. We have lots of volcanic activity. It's where the majority of the Earth's earthquakes, landslides, and tsunamis occur, are where we have plate boundaries interacting with one another. Okay, so here I'd like you to take note of a number of things. The first is that most continents occupy a single continental plate. There are a few exceptions, but we don't need to concern ourselves with those. Now, I've circled in red here the Lesser Antilles that I just mentioned on the previous slide as islands that are the product of plate boundaries interacting. So here we have the Caribbean plate interacting with the North American plate and the South American plate. So things are moving and one plate is going underneath the other, and what we end up with is an arc of islands out in the Caribbean. And these islands are actually still volcanically active. So some of the Lesser Antilles are active volcanoes that periodically erupt. You should also take note of the Pacific Plate. It's one of the largest plates. Out in the middle of the Pacific Plate is where Hawaii is. So you'll notice it's just right in the middle of the Pacific Plate, basically right under where it says Pacific. And so these would be intraplate islands, the Hawaiian Islands. Now far to the left of the Pacific Plate, where those black lines with black triangles are, there are again plate boundaries. And at that boundary, we have the Pacific Plate crashing into the Eurasian Plate. And that has created the mountainous island chain of Japan, the islands of the Philippines and Indonesia and New Guinea. So all of this plate-on-plate interaction has created lots of tectonic activity, including the earthquakes and tsunamis that we've become quite familiar with over there. You've probably learned of this, that this edge of the Pacific Plate representing the ring of fire. Okay? It's because there's so much tectonic activity where these plates interact. But if you think about the distribution of islands in the world, the vast majority of the islands are where the Pacific Plate meets the Eurasian Plate. There are thousands of islands in this region. Okay? Here is a zoomed in view of the Lesser Antilles. So these are illustrated in green here. So the bottom right largest island, that's Trinidad, and the gray island closest to the greens up top, the kind of big square shaped one, that's Puerto Rico. So everything between Puerto Rico and Trinidad, this island arc is the edge of the interaction of the Caribbean Plate and the North American Plate. So these two plates interacting, one going beneath the other. Okay? And if you look at the inset image I've put in the bottom left, you'll see that plate B, so the plate on the right, is going under the plate on the left. And what that does is create this area where the rock that's being pushed under melts and then comes back up and creates these volcanoes that become islands once they pop up out of the water. And you end up with a linear chain, or in this instance, a curvilinear chain of islands. Here you can see the distribution of the Hawaiian Islands as well as some of the other island chains, the Easter Island chain and the Austral Seamount chain. And what you'll notice is that each of these three chains is kind of oriented in the same shape, sort of a bent L or a hockey stick shape. And that's because the Pacific Plate, and these lie right in the middle of the Pacific Plate, the Pacific Plate is moving to the north and to the west. And if you look at the Hawaiian Islands, the Hawaiian Ridge, okay, we'll talk about these islands quite a bit, but the biggest island is to the far right. The smallest island is to the far left. And many of the Hawaiian Islands are actually now underwater. What's happening is, as the plate moves up and to the left in this picture, so northwest, the spot where there is a lot of magma, molten rock underneath the oceanic crust punching through, that spot where it punches through doesn't move, but the plate moves over top. And so periodically it will punch through and create a new volcanic island. And as the plate moves further to the northwest, then it will punch through another spot and create another island in the same chain. Okay? You probably saw in the news last year, the second half of last year, that the big island of Hawaii suffered serious volcanic eruptions. This is something that plagues this island. It is still an active volcano. It is the highest of the Hawaiian Islands, and this is a consequence of its activity. Now, what's really interesting about the Hawaiian Islands and a number of island chains, like the ones I've just shown to you in the middle of the Pacific, these intraplate islands, is that if you look at the bottom, you can see what's happening. There's a hot spot where the asthenosphere reaches up through this mantle plume and punches through the lithosphere. So this rising magma comes up and pops up out of the crust, raises up, comes up out of the water. It comes out of the top of the volcano and runs down the sides and becomes solid rock. So it builds up this large rocky island because there's constantly this magma rising up through the lithosphere. All right. Now what happens is the crust and the lithosphere are sliding to your right. So see down at the bottom in black, it says direction of plate movement. The plate is moving to the right. What does not move is that hot spot. Okay? So what you're seeing here is the 5 islands to the right of the current volcanic island are previous, now extinct volcanic islands. So when a volcano is no longer active, it's said to be extinct. It's extinct because the hot spot is no longer under that island. Okay? They are just underneath them is simple lithosphere, and they behave like any other island. Now what you see here, as you go further and further to the right, you'll see that the islands are shorter and shorter, many of them lying beneath the surface of the ocean. This is exactly what we see when we look at the islands of the Hawaiian chain, where the youngest, largest island is an active volcano, and as you move further north and west, you see islands that are shorter. I'll say shorter. They have less and less elevation emergent from the ocean. And then beyond the islands that have emergent land at present, there are a number of sunken islands or seamounts. Okay, so a seamount is simply a mountain under the ocean. Okay, it may or may not have been up out of the ocean in the past, but it is presently below the ocean. There are a couple of other terms here that are mentioned in your text that you should be familiar with. So Guayote or Guayo, these are islands that basically over millions of years have eroded. So all the rain that falls and all the wave action that hits these islands wears down the rock and erodes them to the point where they are no longer sticking up out of the ocean. Okay. The next 2 islands, the Barrier Reef and the Atoll, are interesting, and it's tough to see because of the watermark of the image that I stole from the internet. But you can see the Barrier Reef forms around this sinking island. So reefs grow, coral reefs grow, they're living animals. They grow at a very specific depth. They can't be too dark, they won't get any sunlight, they can't be too shallow, they'll stick out and they'll die once they're out of the water. But you can end up with barrier reefs that surround these islands because they're growing on the shoulders of the sinking island. And what ends up happening frequently is that the island itself will sink in the center and you end up with an atoll. Because the shoulders, these coral reefs on the shoulders of the sinking mountain, they can grow, okay? They can regenerate, but the mountain itself, the sinking island, cannot regenerate as rain and wind and waves take their toll. They erode the island itself, but the coral reef, the fringing reef, as you will sometimes see it said, continues to grow and maintains its proximity to the surface, and sometimes the sea level might drop and expose a circular or ring-shaped island. Okay, so I've mentioned a couple times fluctuations in sea level going up, sea level going down. And you've heard a lot on the news, probably since you were born, about climate change. And there are a lot of arguments, not so much about whether climate change occurs. There's absolutely no doubt climate change occurs. There's argument about whether humans are affecting climate change, whether they are accelerating the rate of climate change. And on that, there's little to no dissension among scientists, but the public likes to believe that their beliefs and acknowledgement of a scientific truth affects whether or not it's true. But we'll ignore that for the moment and consider only how climate has changed in the past and how that has affected biodiversity, specifically with respect to islands. Okay? So we think about, and there have been cartoons and movies made about ice ages, right? And we think about all of this ice, and indeed there was an enormous amount of the world's water tied up in ice. There were glaciers covering the northern United States that were kilometers thick. Think of that. A sheet of ice, kilometers thick, that covered Michigan and Minnesota. Okay? What does that mean for global water levels, moisture levels? Well, I can tell you that if a lot of the water is frozen into those giant ice cubes covering continents, then it's got to come from somewhere. And where it comes from, in a large part, are the oceans. If you look here, you can see the last 25 million years, the elevation of a specific atoll. Okay? So the gray bars represent how high the coral reefs were around this specific atoll, but that black squiggly line is the sea level curve. So that line indicates where sea level was relative to today's sea level. So today is 0, okay? So if you look 25 million years ago, well, at the very beginning of our graph, the sea level was almost 150 meters below where it is today, okay? That is unbelievable. Think about what Florida would like, what the Florida Keys would look like if sea level were 150 meters or 450 feet below where it is now. Florida would be enormous, okay? You can see that sea level has gone up between 25 and 15 million years ago, and then it began going back down. So it was as much as 125 to 150 meters above current levels, okay? There would be no Florida at 450 feet higher sea level, okay? It went back down, and you can see that the atoll at sea surface, those gray bars, they track very closely the sea level, okay? Because if the coral reef is stuck up out of the ocean, it gets eroded back to sea level, okay? You can't have the waves crashing on that coral. It simply erodes it very quickly, much more quickly than it would erode rock, okay? So what causes this fluctuation in sea level? Well, and climate. So here we can see that the temperature has changed quite dramatically over the last 800,000 years, okay? 0 is today's current temperature, okay? And you can see for that, the majority of the last 800,000 years, temperatures have been significantly lower, okay? So it's often said that we currently live in a hot, drowned world, okay? And relative to the last million years, it's basically hotter and wetter than it's been at any point in the last million years, okay? But you can see these fluctuations are quite natural and normal. Temperature goes up and it goes back down for a long time. And then it goes up for a short period and then it goes back down, okay? All of the arguments that you hear about climate change right now are not so much about whether or not this should happen. It's about whether the current peak is going well beyond where any of these peaks are, and it's going faster, okay? But in any case, what do you think these climatic fluctuations over the past million years meant for sea level, for the distribution of organisms? This is an important consideration as we think about and discuss the origin of biodiversity on islands. Okay, we're going to wrap up this chapter by discussing the formation of the islands in the Caribbean and then talking a bit about climate on islands. Okay? So understanding the origins of the Caribbean are quite important to our course, particularly because we're going to be traveling through the Caribbean and visiting some of these islands. Okay, so you may want to familiarize yourselves with the major islands of the Caribbean. And here we see an illustration of the formation of the Greater Antilles, so the bigger main islands of the Caribbean over the past 50 million years. And what's really interesting is that you may not realize it, but North America and South America were not always connected. 50 million years ago, they were two separate continents, not connected by Central America. The larger Antilles, the Greater Antilles, actually moved from being out in the Pacific. They moved eastward through this gap between Mexico and South America, as you can see in section A. So you can see Cuba, Northern Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica illustrated here. They're moving north and east. If you go to figure B, they've gone through this gap between North and South America, and they're starting to establish their current orientation with relationship to one another. Although note island SH, okay? Somewhere between Jamaica and NH, Northern Hispaniola. What this is Southern Hispaniola. So Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, it's the Dominican Republic and Haiti. That island, Hispaniola, actually used to be two, and we're seeing here how those two came together. Right? Move up to figure C, and you can see these islands have moved quite quickly. Southern Hispaniola is approaching Northern Hispaniola. You can see the Lesser Antilles are forming in that arc region to the far right. And by the late Miocene, 10 million years ago, the islands are largely in their current positions. What's really interesting about the islands is attempted to be made clear by this figure from your text. This is not a very clear figure until you understand what it's trying to show you, and it's actually super cool. Okay, so take a look at it and think about what the scale on the x-axis is. It's time. So far left is 50 million years ago, far right is the present. Okay, and what we have in the present, if you look to the far right, we have Western South America touching Central America. Okay, it's connected. When did that happen? Very recently. Okay, you look down, we have Jamaica, we have Cuba, but look at this next thing. We have two dotted lines fused. Southern Hispaniola and Northern Hispaniola fusing. Interesting. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay. We then have Puerto Rico, the Lesser Antilles. Now that dashed line doesn't start until about 30 million years ago. Okay, because those islands didn't exist. They popped up out of the middle of the ocean because of those plate boundary interactions. Okay, and then South America, the primary portion of South America, is at the bottom, so we won't worry about that. Now, there's two interesting things I want you to see and recognize here that this is showing you. One is Southern Hispaniola was by itself for a long time, and then it crashed into Northern Hispaniola. We're going to see that more in the next slide. Okay, those black wavy bits indicate that an island was largely underwater or entirely underwater. So this is really interesting because of, if you look at the Jamaican line, what you can see is that Jamaica is just as old as these other islands, Cuba, Northern Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Southern Hispaniola. But unlike Cuba, Northern Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico, Jamaica was underwater for a long time. Okay? So what do you think that means for the biodiversity of Jamaica relative to Cuba? Can there be things on Jamaica that are as old as the things that are on Cuba? Not if it was underwater until 20 million years ago. Okay? So these are the kinds of things that we need to take into account when we look at an island and think about its biodiversity and compare it to other islands. And we're going to be doing a lot of that. So let's look at Hispaniola. Again, this is divided longitudinally. You can see on the top left, Haiti on the left, Dominican Republic on the right. If you look at the topography, the landscape of Hispaniola on the bottom right, or the bottom half of this slide, you'll see that there's this lowland gap that separates this, what used to be southern Hispaniola, this mountainous finger to the south, from the larger island to the north. And what is so cool about this is, now that you've seen the geological history, you understand that these were two islands that have since collided, and very recently collided. It should make sense to you when you look at biological patterns like this group of frogs, okay? Look at this group of frogs, these Eleutherodactylus, and where each of these species can be found, okay? So the maps to the right of each frog image, it's shaded red where you can find that species of frog. And in each of these instances, you'll note that the frog is found either on the southern Hispaniolan portion or the northern Hispaniolan portion, okay? That middle guy, Pictissimus, he looks like he's spilled a bit out of the southern Hispaniola portion, but not by much, okay? What we have is an island that is the product of two islands crashing together. It's got two islands worth of biodiversity, and that's something we are going to learn more about in the next couple weeks. All right, when we visit these islands, it's going to become very clear to you that they are very different. No two islands are created equal. They have very unique histories, very unique origins, and what's more, their topography, their landscape has a significant impact on the biodiversity that can exist on that island, okay? So we can have islands like Jamaica. The very first island that we're going to visit is exceptionally high. It has rainforests on the top. It's got all sorts of biodiversity. The second island we're going to visit, Grand Cayman, very low, has very different topography. It's pretty flat. There's nothing very high on that island. And that affects patterns of biodiversity. So if you look at the bottom right image, you'll see that there's the illustration of a mountainous island that has northern and southern exposure. And look what's happening here. If the winds are generally blowing from north to south, they're bringing with them clouds that hit the island, drop their rain, so there's a forested zone. Above that forested zone, it's higher than the clouds, you get a subalpine zone. So for example, in the big island of Hawaii, there's beautiful rainforests as you go up the mountain, until you get to the point where it's so high that it's cold and there's no rain, it's just snow, okay? So these high elevation islands have, their topography gives them the ability to have multiple vegetation zones, which means they can house a lot more organisms. I also want you to read the section of the text that describes the top left figure here, figure 216, okay? And this is a really interesting phenomena because the elevation of an island affects where you find certain habitats. And this is illustrating where you find on different islands mossy forest, okay? So wet, moist forest. On the highest islands that are 53 kilometers from the coast and they're 3 kilometers high, you only find mossy forest in the very top half kilometer, okay? So you don't find it below 2.5 kilometers elevation. What's interesting is, as you look at smaller mountains closer to the, smaller islands closer to the coast, you still get that mossy forest, and you get it at elevations of, let's say, 1 kilometer, 1,000 meters. You don't find that forest on the higher mountains further away, okay? This illustrates a pattern that you don't have consistent habitats that have rules that apply across all islands. These habitats, their distribution, their occurrence, these mossy forests on these islands, their occurrence is dictated not only by the elevation, but also by the overall structure and position of the island, okay? Islands are complicated beasts, and they're things that's why we get to discuss them for 2 weeks. Okay, a few last things towards the end of this chapter that I want to touch on because they are critically important as we think about island biodiversity. The first is the availability of fresh water. That's absolutely imperative if you're to have a significant amount of biodiversity on an island. If you're not just going to have birds that fly there and nest there and go get their water elsewhere. Okay, water has to be available on the islands for species, whether it's just licking the dew off of leaves or the availability of lakes and ponds and rivers. Okay, really small islands don't have the ability to percolate a lot of rainwater, retain it in this freshwater lens that exists within the rock of the island, making it available to plant and animal species. Okay, so I just want you to think about when rain falls on an island, what happens to that fresh water? Some of it just washes right off to the edge, down to the beach, and washes into the ocean. But depending on the size, a lot of it may percolate through the rock and form this freshwater lens, providing a source of water for plants and animals. Okay. Another thought or point that we must consider with respect to water are oceanic currents. And we are very interested in oceanic currents as we study island biodiversity for a number of reasons. Okay. The first is, if you think back to the mechanisms of dispersal, the ways in which organisms can colonize islands, the first one we talked about was rafting. So if an organism on the coast of, let's say, northern South America, northeastern South America, okay, if it washes out to sea in a big storm on a log, look at the direction of those currents. Is that, let's say it's an iguana on a log, is it going to float towards Florida, or is it going to float towards Africa? It's not an either or, it's definitely going to float towards Florida. Okay, you can see all of those arrows on the northern coast of South America are pointing to the west and northwest, pushing those currents and anything that's rafting into the Caribbean. Okay, so there are a lot of interesting patterns that we can observe in global biodiversity that are a clear product of dispersal, rafting, by organisms that just floated passively on these currents from one place to another. Okay. Another important aspect about currents is that they bring with them, frequently they will bring with them wind, rain, and warmth. Okay. If you look at Madagascar, so I've got a little bit of the previous image cropped here and a red arrow pointing to Madagascar off the coast of Africa. And what's really interesting is that we have the currents and the wind coming from the east. So they're hitting the right side or the east side of Madagascar. Okay, you can infer that from some of the arrows on the left. And look at this map of rainfall, annual rainfall in Madagascar. What's really cool about the island of Madagascar is it's big enough and high enough that it has a really very diverse set of habitats. But look how much rainfall there is on the east coast. It's super blue-green, okay? You're getting more than 3 meters of rain, okay? 9 feet of rain each year on the eastern coast. Look at the far southwest corner, okay? You're getting not even 1/10 of that, all right? So instead of getting 9 feet, okay, you're getting less than 1 foot of rain, okay, in the southwest. So you have dry desert-like area in the southwest, you have rainforest on the east coast. But look at the currents to the northwest of Madagascar. What's really neat is where that green arrow is that I've put on the northwest coast of Madagascar. Look at that area and the little inset current figure to the left. The currents actually hit Africa, coming from the east, and curl back around and come and hit the west coast of Madagascar. You actually get more rainfall on the northwest coast than you do on the northeast coast because of those oceanic currents bringing that stuff back around and hitting Madagascar on the northwest side, on the backside. This is just to illustrate to you how important oceanic currents and wind directions are for structuring biodiversity. If I want to look for rainforest species in Madagascar, I'm going to go to the northwest, not the southwest. I'm going to go to the east coast, not the northeast coast. Okay? Okay. The chapter ends talking about island disturbances, and this is something that's been in the news quite a bit lately. As you hopefully have seen, there was a volcanic eruption of Krakatoa. There was a huge landslide, and it caused a tsunami that hit Indonesia. Okay? These tsunamis have a dramatic impact on human habitations on the coastlines, but as you can imagine, these do and have historically affected biodiversity on islands. So, not to mention the effects of biodiversity on Krakatoa itself. So there are a lot of species that live on that island, and they're certainly suffering because of these eruptions. In fact, that island has the last 30 remaining Indonesian rhinoceros, and they're working to evacuate all of those individuals from that island because of this eruption. None were killed in the eruption. It was on the other side of the island. Some of the people that worked to conserve those rhinos were killed, but the rhinos survived. But again, this gets at the uniqueness of islands, their isolated nature, and how we can work to protect them. This is just a heat map showing how impactful these natural disturbances can be. So, as you're probably well aware, a strong hurricane hit Puerto Rico a year ago, and the forests there were pretty decimated. Okay, not just humans and their habitations, forests also suffered quite dramatic destruction, and this is something that is not uncommon. It happens naturally. The organisms that live on these islands have evolved in the face of these type of disturbances, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have a significant impact on them and might not lead to extinction. And finally, I'd like you to take some time considering Figure 220 because it highlights the different types of disturbances that occur on islands, their spatial scale on the x-axis. So how big of an area do they affect, right? So if there's a fire, if there's a pathogen, if there's climatic fluctuation, how big of an area do those affect, right? So a disturbance event, the very bottom left corner of the left figure, that's like me going in and cutting down a big forest to grow pineapples, okay? The spatial scale of that is pretty small, okay? And the temporal scale, how long is that going to affect things? It's going to affect things for a while, not as long as plate tectonics or climatic fluctuations, right? So this just illustrates the interaction between how big of an area do things affect, so the x-axis, and how long they affect things. Some environmental disturbances have very long-lasting effects. Some have very wide-ranging effects. So they might be bigger on one axis, the x-axis, than the y-axis, okay? And if you look at the biotic responses to disturbances on the right, the figure on the right, so competition, gap phase replacement, secondary succession, these are things that describe very short-term, very small-scale responses of biodiversity. So, secondary succession, what is that? If we go cut down 20,000 acres in Puerto Rico to grow pineapples, and then I go bankrupt and my pineapple farm turns back into forest, what's going to happen is it doesn't just stay pineapples forever. Weeds will grow up, and then other, larger, woodier weeds will grow up, and then palm trees, and then oaks and pine trees start growing in there. It takes a while before it becomes a normal forest again. Okay, so the spatial scale is small, the time scale is relatively small. Okay, the responses to biotic events that are much larger, like ecosystem change, speciation, extinction, those occur at much larger scales, and they take place over many more years. Okay, and the largest scale in terms of both time and space are biotic evolution. So those things occur on much larger scales than any of those others. Okay, that's it for chapter 2. Go ahead and make sure you've read chapter 3 before you do the next video. I'm hoping you're not falling asleep, trying to make it exciting. It's awesome stuff. I don't know how you could not. So enjoy. I'll see you in chapter 3.